a mythical sunken empire said to be lost 12,000 years ago. First described by the Greek philosopher Plato.
The fact that Plato originated the story of Atlantis gave it a great amount of weight.
The Atlantis legend has inspired searches for Plato's utopia at pivotal moments in history by some of the greatest explorers from Columbus onwards.
One of the impetuses for the exploration westwards across the Atlantic was the Atlantis myth.
A myth later seized upon by the Nazis, who in their attempt to prove their racial superiority were desperate to claim Atlantis as their own. Its whereabouts still remain a puzzle. But are we misguided to search for a physical Atlantis? Is the idyllic civilization in fact a philosophical challenge set for us by Plato? Can Atlantis ever be found? The search for the lost civilization of Atlantis, thought to exist some 12,000 years ago, has inspired adventurers through the ages. Still today, thinkers and scientists strive to find it. It's a quest that began here, in the first city of ancient Greece, Athens, where in the 4th century BC, the philosopher Plato wrote the world's first account of Atlantis.
Plato was essentially the father of Western philosophy, and because what he had to say was so important and has remained important, it became much more acceptable, much more respectable, if you will, than if someone else had written it.
Plato first heard the story of Atlantis at a dinner party when he was a boy. Among the guests was his teacher, the philosopher Socrates. The legend of Atlantis, he learned, was already generations old, handed down by a famous Greek sage called Solon.
Solon was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. He was a very, very important personality historically because he established the basis from which Athenian democracy eventually developed. He was a poet and a scientist and a statesman. And one of the things that he did is to have visited Egypt. It's almost like a pilgrimage that all the ancient Greek sages made. And in Egypt, he first supposedly heard the story of Atlantis.
Some 200 years before Plato's time, Solon visited Egypt and was shown records of a long-lost civilization that had dominated the world 9,000 years before. The Empire of Atlantis. The description the Egyptian priest gave Solon is the starting point for every search for Atlantis. A description which, in Plato's words,
has the great advantage of being a fact and not a fiction.
Atlantis was said to lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Plato was very, very specific about where Atlantis was and what size it was, and he described it as being larger than the continents of Africa and Asia put together, and he located it very carefully outside the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules are what we know now as the Straits of Gibraltar. And when you locate something outside the Pillars of Hercules, you are locating it in the Atlantic Ocean, just to the west of Spain and North Africa.
According to Plato, Atlantis was dominated by a rectangular plain, surrounded on three sides by mountains. A land of rare plants and exotic animals. Plato's words portrayed an earthly paradise.
That sacred island, which then beheld the light of the sun, brought forth infinite abundance and the blessings of the earth.
He tells us about the flowers, the plants, the kind of metals the people use, the kind of the way that each canal and each channel is built. He puts in elephants. In fact, it's only the second time that they're mentioned in Greek literature when Plato describes Atlantis. What does all that piling up of detail and very strange detail do? Well, it does two things. First, it makes it very exotic and something very strange. But because there's so much of it, it also makes it seem real.
Plato describes the magnificent capital city of Atlantis as laid out in circles of land and water, each ring home to new wonders.
There were docks for huge numbers of ships and a causeway over which they could offload the riches that were coming into Atlantis. In other words, everything that human beings could need was available in Atlantis itself.
Connected to the ocean by a canal 100 feet deep and several miles long, at the center of the city, the citadel housed spectacular treasures. Plato describes a land of plenty.
They had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings, and is not likely ever to be again.
Plato tells us that for long ages, the Atlanteans lived at peace with the rest of the world in their island paradise. But this heaven on earth was not to last.
Human nature got the upper hand. They became tainted with unrighteous ambition.
The Atlanteans pushed forward their empire, enslaving all before them. And then a natural disaster laid waste to most of the world, completely destroying Atlantis.
Violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea.
It was this legend, related to Solon in Egypt, which many years later was told at the Athenian dinner party. There's no doubt that Plato's short account of an after-dinner conversation began the legend that still inspires 24 centuries later. But outside Plato's circle, the story of Atlantis did not rank alongside the ancient Greeks' other myths.
We don't have versions of Atlantis the same way that we have versions of the Trojan War or of Jason's expedition to get the Golden Fleece or all the other great stories of Greek mythology. Nobody picks up that story to make something of it. It sort of sinks very much in the way that Atlantis itself sank in the depths of the ocean for a very long time.
The myth of Atlantis would be lost for 18 centuries, disappearing into the shadows of the Dark Ages. The lost civilization of Atlantis was forgotten until European explorers inaugurated an age of discovery in the 15th century. Then the search for Atlantis began in earnest with history's most famous explorer, Christopher Columbus. It was during the brutal times of the Spanish Inquisition that Columbus determined to sail for the trade opportunities of the Far East. But the great navigator had a secret reason for such a dangerous voyage. He had heard of a lost paradise, a mythical island called Antillia, a name that had replaced Atlantis in the medieval imagination.
He knew the myths. He wasn't a stupid mariner just hoping to head off and find something on the far side of the ocean. He was looking for things related to the Atlantis myth. We know that other seafarers were doing the same thing at the same time. So there was actually one of the impetuses for the exploration westwards across the Atlantic was the Atlantis myth.
Armed with the most recent maps, Columbus's picture of the world was not unlike our own, with two major exceptions. The undiscovered continent of America was absent, and no one could be sure what islands lay in the Atlantic. But the great navigator considered the existence of one mythical island absolutely certain, Antillia, in the Atlantic, said to be a land of limitless wealth, its beaches sprinkled with gold.
We know that he thought he was looking for the Indies, but we know also that he was looking for gold and spices and riches, and certainly at least part of what he was doing was looking for Antillia or Atlantis.
So on August the 2nd, 1492, Columbus set off to cross the Atlantic. "2,000 miles from Spain, he ordered his tiny three-ship fleet to set a northwesterly course, in precisely the direction that Antillia was thought to be. After 6 days searching and 2 more changes of direction, Columbus abandoned his frantic search for Antillia, or Atlantis. The decision probably saved the expedition. After nearly 3 months at sea, Columbus and his men made landfall. They had crossed the vast ocean and reached the Americas. But Antillia and its legendary riches were never found, although its name lives on in a chain of Caribbean islands, the Antilles. A 150 years after Columbus discovered America, the search for the lost legacy of Atlantis moved to Mexico. Don Carlos Siguenza was a poet, mathematician, astronomer, and engineer, and one of the first archaeologists in history. Born in Mexico City, he was a Creole of mixed race and considered an inferior by the country's Spanish rulers. He was determined to prove that the ancestors of Mexico's Indians had forged a culture to rival ancient Rome. He first learned of Atlantis while studying to be a Jesuit, when he came across the work of Athanasius Kircher, who in 1665 issued a map of the lost continent. Expelled from the Jesuit order for lack of discipline, Siguenza turned to science. He conducted groundbreaking studies of eclipses, then traveled to the ruins of the ancient city of Teotihuacan. What he found there overwhelmed him. The city bore all the hallmarks of an advanced civilization: evidence of astronomy, hieroglyphic writing, and pyramid building, uncannily similar to that of ancient Egypt.
He saw many parallels between Egypt and the early Mexican culture in the calendar, in the way of dress, in the hieroglyphics, and in the pyramids.
In these ruins, Siguenza believed he had found the answer to the ancient riddle of Atlantis.
What he was trying to do, I believe, was to connect Atlantis, Plato's ideas, with the Bible. Siguenza would have jumped from the myth of Atlantis, which would have been kind of the foundation for him, to biblical prophecy of people dispersing across the globe after the deluge.
Fusing scientific ideas with his belief in the truth of the Bible, Siguenza concluded that the destruction of Atlantis and Noah's flood had been one and the same event. The vast deluge had swept away Atlantis. Survivors sought refuge in Mexico and Egypt, where they built the pyramids. But a modern disaster was about to strike. In 1691, a riot broke out in Mexico City. Provoked by the cruelty of their Spanish overlords, the native population rebelled. Fires spread through the city. A mob set the National Archives ablaze. Siguenza raced to the scene. The archives contained countless documents in which he had hoped to find proof of his theories about the Atlantean origins of Mexico. He plunged into the flames to save whatever he could. His efforts preserved much of the knowledge of early Mexico that survives today. But they could not provide him with the means he needed to date the pyramids of Teotihuacan. Siguenza would never know that the city reached its height in 750 AD, 10,000 years after the date Plato gave for Atlantis' destruction. Don Carlos Siguenza was the first to search for physical proof of the lost continent. And it was fascination with ancient Egypt that opened the next chapter in the pursuit of Atlantis in 19th century France. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1799, his archaeologists' findings generated a French obsession with the ancient world. In time inspiring Jules Verne to take the story of Atlantis into the imagination of a wider public.
Here were the encrusted remains of an acropolis, with the floating forms of a Parthenon. Here were the vestiges of an ancient port buried beneath the sea, Atlantis.
Jules Verne's description of the lost city in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was perhaps the most spellbinding since Plato's.
It was published in 1870, enormously popular book. The drawings that actually accompanied the book showed people marching around in sunken Greek temples, and this, of course, was kind of an interesting concept, and probably was the element that got people more and more interested in Atlantis, the idea that underwater you could walk around in sunken Greek temples.
Verne's fantasy Atlantis, located amid undersea volcanoes in the Atlantic, was so convincing that it would soon inspire a writer half a world away to prove that Atlantis really did exist. In his study in Minnesota, Ignatius Donnelly, a failed politician, wrote a bestseller of his time. His ideas made him the father of the modern hunt for a real Atlantis. In 1880, out of office and down on his luck, Donnelly began the book for which he is now most famous, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The story of Atlantis had intrigued Donnelly since he read Plato as a boy. With time on his hands, he read all he could on the subject. Ignatius Donnelly was inspired to locate the sunken continent by an archaeological find that had shed a new light on the myths of the ancient world. 10 years earlier, Heinrich Schliemann had uncovered in Turkey the ruins of the ancient city of Troy and treasures from the mythical war between Greeks and Trojans.
Before Schliemann, people had thought that what Homer had written was fiction. He made this up. There wasn't really a city of Troy, but what Schliemann did was he read Homer carefully, and he figured out correctly where Troy would be located if you performed a literal translation of Homer.
This astonishing find persuaded Donnelly that if Schliemann could discover Troy by examining Homer, then he might discover Atlantis by examining Plato. Donnelly tirelessly searched until a theory began to emerge. The similarity of plants, animals, and ancient cultures on both sides of the Atlantic convinced him that the remains of the lost continent lay somewhere in the middle of the ocean. By coincidence, the first survey of the Atlantic seabed had just indicated that a ridge of undersea mountains stretched from Iceland to South America, their highest peaks being the islands of the Azores and the Canaries. For Donnelly, the riddle was solved. These mountains had once been above the surface, but their volcanoes had sunk them, destroying the civilization of Atlantis in the process. When it was published in 1882, Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, was an overnight bestseller. It portrayed Atlantis as an advanced seafaring empire with colonies all over the world, an empire that Donnelly believed
lived under a kingly government and had their courts, judges, records, their boats, their highways, aqueducts, wharves, docks, and canals. They knew the use of the magnet and of gunpowder. In short, they were in enjoyment of a civilization nearly as high as our own.
Atlantis fever swept the nation. In 1883, the New Orleans Mardi Gras even adopted it as its theme. And letters of congratulation arrived from all over the world.
Because his book was so popular, people tended to believe that it was fact. A good parallel, I think, is with Peter Benchley's book, Jaws. What Benchley has the white shark doing in Jaws does not actually happen. But think about how many people read this book and became absolutely terrified to swim in the ocean. It is possible for people to take what is essentially a work of fiction, but if it's presented cleverly enough, and if it has enough science woven into it, to believe that it's absolute fact.
The father of Atlantology, Donnelly was the first to convince the public that Atlantis really could be found. Little did he realize that his work would prompt a search for the lost continent that was literally out of this world. In the 1870s, a new fad took America by storm. Spiritualism was about to move the story of Atlantis into a whole new dimension. The Russian aristocrat Helena Petrovna Blavatsky had arrived in New York after traveling the world. She was to become the herald of a new age of spirituality in which Atlantis would hold the key to cosmic enlightenment. With her air of cultivated mystery and her unusual behavior, Madame Blavatsky soon became a star of the New York seance scene. She claimed to be in touch with forces she called the Cosmic Masters, survivors of the destruction of Atlantis she'd encountered when traveling in Tibet many years before. Now, after an apprenticeship of 20 years, the Cosmic Masters wanted her to bring about a new age of spiritual enlightenment. In 1888, Blavatsky wrote a book, The Secret Doctrine, in which she attempted to set out the principles of God wisdom, or theosophy, that the Cosmic Masters of Atlantis had imparted to her. Blavatsky claimed that they were the progenitors of the human race, and that while some peoples retained the Atlantean purity of their ancient ancestors, others, notably the Jews, had not. Madame Blavatsky's ideas would cast a long shadow over the story of Atlantis. The propagandists of the Third Reich were the first to latch on to her theories of a pure Atlantean race. As soon as Hitler and the Nazis seized power in Germany in 1933, they initiated quests for objects and places from the earliest myths. The Lost Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, and the lost continent of Atlantis.
The search for these sorts of objects made for great publicity. I mean, this kind of stuff just looks good in the headlines, you know, where the archaeologists out looking for the Ark. In fact, there was a major concern within the profession that German archaeologists were going to become the laughingstock of their colleagues outside of Germany because of this type of lunatic fringe research.
The Nazis' obsession with pursuing mythical objects and places had its roots in the disaster of World War I. By the war's end, millions lay dead. Defeat plunged Germany into a chaos of hyperinflation and extremist politics. Insecure, the Germans turned to the ancient past for a way to reinvent themselves in the present.
We're dealing with a nation in the 1920s in Germany, which is going through a kind of identity crisis. It's feeling underappreciated, and obviously it's in search of symbolism that will allow it to feel better about itself. And basically, it's sort of a self-esteem issue. And archaeology was one of the ways that, that Germans attempted to kind of create a picture of themselves that they could be proud of.
As archaeologists excavated the remote past, folkish or people groups formed and organized events to celebrate the strength and vitality of the German race. Their members were among the keenest advocates of extremely unorthodox ideas that linked Germany's past with the myth of Atlantis. Published in the early 1930s, the novels of Edmund Kiss told of how in the forgotten past an ice moon had collided with the Earth, bringing with it the seed of Aryan man. Superior to the ape men of Earth, this Aryan race had established the world's first civilization on islands in the Atlantic Ocean, Atlantis. Incredibly, Kiss's novels were based on ideas which many Germans believed to be fact. Hitler himself believed that they were a true, if fictionalized, representation of what actually happened. Kiss's Atlantis closely resembled Plato's, but instead of a fantastic temple in the center of the city, Kiss put a vast war office echoing plans for the Nazis' rebuilding of Berlin. As Kiss wrote,
"Only time will tell where the limits of our power lie. We must build a community that will demonstrate to all the visible signs of our Nordic blood. The whiteness of our skin, the blueness of our eyes, our freedom of spirit uncorrupted by the base superstitions of religion.
Enthralled by the concept of an Aryan Atlantis, German expeditions departed to the forests of Guatemala in Central America to investigate the overgrown ruins of the Mayan civilization. A civilization that had reached its height long after Plato's date for Atlantis' destruction. It was nonetheless here that archaeologists unearthed misshapen skulls that local people claimed to be those of Atlanteans. This documentary film of these discoveries played to packed audiences in German cinemas in 1933. But the archaeologists were evasive about what they had really discovered. The results of an ancient Native American practice in which the heads of young children are bound for religious reasons. But the Third Reich's obsession with Atlantis and other myths went much further than appeasing the German public's appetite for mystery. In 1934, a year after this film about Atlantis was made, the Ahnenerbe, a specialist division of the SS, was formed. Though many members didn't yet know it, the Ahnenerbe's aim was no less than the reinvention of German history. When war broke out in 1939 and German armies swept across Europe, the scientists of the SS Ahnenerbe followed, using archaeology to claim that the Nazis were merely reclaiming land that once belonged to the Aryan race. As the war progressed, the myth of Atlantis began to assume a far more malign role. The lost racially pure homeland of Atlantis became the model for the new Nazi Germany.
That meant removing elements that were not Nordic from the population, from the breeding population and from the culture. And genocide then becomes an option. So I think the Atlantis myth plays a role there quite definitely.
Generally, myths of the Golden Age are extremely double-edged because they give authority and they give legitimacy to ideas which may otherwise find no justification.
At the war's end, the full extent of the Holocaust became horrifyingly clear. The myth of Atlantis had come full circle, transformed from the story of an earthly paradise into the ideology behind a genocidal nightmare. Most of the Ahnenerbe escaped punishment for their role in the atrocities.
Archaeologists who survived the war seem to have done a pretty effective cleanup job in the archives.
Atlantis' connection with the Third Reich was forgotten almost immediately. But across the Atlantic, mythmakers of an entirely different sort were also reinventing Atlantis as pure fantasy. Most famous of all Atlantis movies is probably the 1961 Atlantis, the Lost Continent, in which a humble fisherman saves the beautiful Princess Antilia from the evil masters of Atlantis. But The Lost Continent was only the most memorable of a whole genre of B-movies and serials that have continued to reinvent Atlantis.
Go ahead and ram. Ram the gate!
There's something about the Atlantis theory that everybody loves. And even now, or in recent times, people have used it in movies, they've used it in novels. There are serials made in the 1930s about Crash Corrigan and the undersea kingdom of Atlantis, and a wonderful kind of idea of Crash on a horse riding through Atlantis, which looks very much like the Monument Valley in the American West, because I think they just happened to be there, and they said, well, why don't we make an Atlantis movie? Okay, you put the saucepan on your head, and we'll do that.
From the film The Man from Atlantis, who sought to help the US Navy protect the free world, to the warlords of Atlantis, who wanted to enslave it, Atlantis was portrayed in almost every conceivable way, except as a real place. But that was about to change. In the late 1960s, the search for Atlantis moved from the realm of fantasy right into reality. Santorini is a group of small volcanic Greek islands. In 1967, an archaeologist, Spiridon Marinatos, discovered under layers of volcanic rock the remains of a city that perished over 35 centuries ago, Akrotiri. Had the destruction of this city given rise to the myth of Atlantis? The story of his momentous find began nearly 70 years before on an island south of Santorini, Crete. In 1899, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans had begun unearthing on Crete the remains of a forgotten civilization, which he called Minoan.
The Minoans are probably the single greatest mystery in all of classical history. We don't really know where they came from, and certainly don't know what happened to them. But they were building these elaborate palaces and making these fabulous frescoes long before anybody else was doing. This is 1500 BC, and remember that the Parthenon and Plato himself existed around 350 BC.
While excavating a Minoan villa on Crete in the 1930s, Marinatos found evidence of a volcanic explosion, a discovery that would set him on the trail for Atlantis. Marinatos calculated that Santorini, the nearest volcano, had erupted in around 1500 BC. The cataclysmic explosion ripped open the center of Santorini. Aftershocks were felt all over the world. The island was shattered into fragments.
It's the idea of cataclysm. Something as violent as a volcanic explosion of that dimension is a bit like the extinction of the dinosaurs. It's such a dramatic event that it must have been recorded in history somehow. And the only evidence we've got of this eruption being recorded in oral tradition is the Atlantis myth.
Deciding to seek further evidence of Minoan civilization nearer the volcano, Marinatos discovered the remains of an ancient city, Akrotiri, on Santorini. The find made headlines around the world. A forgotten people from ancient history wiped out in one blast. Surely this was the real-life basis for the myth of Atlantis. Entombed by a 30-foot layer of volcanic pumice for more than 3,500 years, Akrotiri was clearly related to the ruins on Minoan Crete. Hundreds, if not thousands of years ahead of its time, there was evidence of showers, flushing toilets, even hot and cold running water. And wall paintings unlike anything previously discovered in the region.
We look at the frescoes and we see very free-flowing, beautiful art, and it's made scholars think of them as gentle people, people without any violence in them. We find that the cities and palaces on Crete are not fortified. So again, we get this vision of a sort of utopian society.
Clearly, they had been an exceptional people, far ahead of their contemporaries. But were the Minoans the Atlanteans of legend? Although there were many similarities between Plato's story of Atlantis and the discoveries on Santorini and Crete, there were important differences. The Minoans disappeared from history nearer 900 than 9,000 years before Plato's time. And even though only a fraction of Akrotiri has been excavated, So far, it bears little resemblance to the Atlantis described by Plato. It's certainly nowhere near the middle of the Atlantic. Academic opinion remains divided. For almost 24 centuries, mankind has been intrigued by Atlantis, and still the search for the lost city continues. Using a dazzling array of high and low-tech equipment, a new breed of explorer continues the quest for Atlantis. Could advances in technology finally reveal the location of the lost civilization? Jim Allen is a former aerial photography analyst for the Royal Air Force. By examining aerial photographs, Allen believes he has located one of the lost continent's most distinctive landmarks, the vast irrigated floodplain of Atlantis, on a plain in Bolivia called the Altiplano. Allen hopes advances in technology will eventually prove his theory.
Modern technology, the satellite mapping, shows we can prove quite positively this is the elongated rectangular plane that Plato talked about.
In Canada, Rand Flemath also believes satellite technology holds the key to finding Atlantis. He believes that in the ancient past, a catastrophic geological event shifted the outer crust of the Earth over its core, moving Atlantis from the temperate Atlantic to the frozen South Pole. He believes he has decoded the exact location of the city of Atlantis, still buried under miles of Antarctic ice.
I think that we have found very specific coordinates on Antarctica that have a strikingly circular object beneath the ice about 1,400 meters, about a mile down, which can be seen by satellite.
Only time will tell if technology will prove the ideas of 21st century Atlantis seekers correct. Throughout the ages, Atlantis hunters have followed the clues in Plato's more than 2,000-year-old description. But have they perhaps taken it a little too literally? Is it a description of fact or fiction?
I think Plato used real characters so that people would accept it as truth. I think, however, that Plato knew he was writing fiction, and Plato intended to write fiction. I don't think that Plato believed a word of it.
But what might have inspired Plato to invent such a story? In 399 BC, Plato's revered tutor, the philosopher Socrates, was arrested in the dead of night. Dragged before an open court, he was charged with corrupting the morals of Athens with his philosophical ideas and sentenced to death. Surrounded by his friends and disciples, Socrates calmly drank poison and passed away into history as one of the great figures of Western civilization. But Plato was inconsolable.
Plato thinks of Socrates as the best and the kindest and the justest man who ever lived. And he sees Athens, a city he loves, turn against him and kill him. That, I believe, was devastating for him. So a lot of Plato's work is an effort to imagine alternative political and social organizations in which the horrible injustice that he sees having been done in the case of Socrates could never happen again. He would like ideally to create a world in which philosophy, in the person of Socrates, would be forever safe.
And one of these ideal cities, where a great teacher like Socrates would be safe and respected, is described in Plato's story about Atlantis. However, the ideal society is not in fact Atlantis.
Of course, one would say, oh, it's Atlantis. No, it isn't. It's Athens. It is the ancient Athens which had all the features that Plato associates with this imaginary ideal state that he has just described.
So was Atlantis no more than a story invented by Plato to compensate for the loss of his mentor, Socrates? Or was it in fact Plato's challenge to the future, to strive for a better world? Certainly, in many, Atlantis has stirred a longing for a lost perfection, an earthly heaven.
I think the Atlantis legend, if you like, has become a new religion. It's a new age religion. I think modern people want to find something they can believe in, even if it's not reachable, not attainable. So they search for a utopia, a fabulous land, and they try and believe in that, even though they can never really find it.
Each period in history, I think, reads both the accomplishment of Atlantis and the reason for its destruction in a different way.
And I think this is probably how the myth has always functioned, how many Golden Age myths have always functioned. We use them to project the things we most admire and of which we are at the same time most afraid.
The search for Atlantis goes on. Many of us just can't resist the idea that somewhere in the deep, Atlantis still lies, awaiting the day when some bold adventurer or new technology finally reveals its secrets. Until that day, Atlantis will remain only in the depths of the imagination, a measure of our humanity, or lack of it.
Criminologists and academics investigate a truly historic crime later this week. Who killed Julius Caesar? Friday at 8. Next, it's time to uncover the forensic evidence surrounding a modern-day killing. Stay with us for CSI Miami.